Hi, and welcome to this final article of question number 6 of the Summa Theologica and Prima Pars, and this is about the goodness of God, and it is his third attribute that we have been talking about. And in this final article, he asks whether all things are good by the divine goodness. Now, this is very interesting because this one threw me for a loop when I first read it, because I thought that since we participate in God's goodness, that this would be true, that all things are good by the divine goodness. But listen to where he goes with this one. He says, all things are good inasmuch as they have being, but they are not called beings through the divine being, but through their own being. Therefore, all things are not good by the divine goodness, but by their own goodness. Now, this one really surprised me because I thought that he was going to go in another direction than this. That means that somehow the goodness that we have is our own, even though we participate in God's goodness. Okay, so let's see how he goes with this. All right, here's a corpus, kind of small print here, but it says, as regards relative things, we must admit intrinsic denomination. Okay, as a thing is denominated, placed from place, and measured from measure. But as regards absolute things, opinions differ. Plato held the existence of separate ideas. Okay, now we haven't really talked a whole lot about this whole idea of separate ideas of Plato, but let's see what he goes here. Of all things, and that individuals were denominated by them as participating in the separate ideas. For instance, that Socrates is called man according to the separate idea of man. Now, just as he laid down separate ideas of man and horse, which he called absolute man and absolute horse, so likewise he laid down separate ideas of being and of one, and these he called absolute being and absolute oneness. And by participation of these, everything was called being and one, and what was the absolute being and absolute one, he said, was the supreme good. And because good is convertible with being, as one is also, he called God the absolute good, and from whom all things are called good by way of participation. Okay, so now he's getting into what Plato taught about separate ideas, because Plato believed that the physical world was only a representation of the real idea of a thing, like he said about hoarseness, and Socrates only being a representation of the absolute man. All right, so he says, continuing here in the corpus, although this opinion appears to be unreasonable in affirming separate ideas of natural things as subsisting of themselves, as Aristotle argues in many ways, still it is absolutely true that there is first something which is essentially being and essentially good, which we call God, as appears from what has been shown above, question 2, article 3, and Aristotle agrees with this. Hence, from the first being essentially such and good, everything can be called good and a being, inasmuch as it participates in it by way of certain assimilation, which is far removed and defective, as appears from the above. Question 4, article 3. All right, so this is really very important here, because we're talking about the relationship between God and his creatures, which we've talked about a lot in these previous articles. And to what degree do we have existence ourselves, or are we just participating in divine existence? All right, so here's the end of the corpus here. Everything is therefore called good from the divine goodness, as from the first exemplary, effective, and final principle of all goodness. Nevertheless, everything is called good by reason of the similitude of the divine goodness belonging to it, which is formally its own goodness, whereby it is denominated good. And so of all things there is one goodness, and yet many goodnesses. This is sufficient reply to the objections. Okay, so what he's going to do here is he's going to have a couple of objections, but he's already answered them. All right, this is the first time this happened in the Summa so far. All right, so this is kind of deep, kind of hard to explain really, but it kind of went in a direction that I didn't think he was going to go. but there is a particular goodness in each individual thing that is theirs alone and not just through participation, right? Okay, so here are the objections. Again, he's not going to answer these individually because he's already answered them, he thinks. Objection 1 says, it seems that all things are good by the divine goodness. For Augustine says, this and that are good, take away this and that, and see good itself if thou canst. And so thou shalt see God good not by any other good, but the good of every good. But everything is good by its own good, therefore everything is good by that very good which is God. Okay? And objection 2, further, as Boethius says, all things are called good accordingly as they are directed to God, and this is by reason of the divine goodness. Therefore, all things are good by the divine goodness. Okay, so this is really interesting, and hopefully that made sense, that goodness belongs to the individual in a certain sense. Okay, we participate in God's perfection, God's goodness, but ultimately the question here was whether all things are good by the divine goodness. We have our own goodness. Okay, God creates us good, and that goodness is not absolutely God because he created us as individual beings. Okay, it's a little bit hard to explain, I must be honest, but hopefully some of that made sense to you, and that's going to bring us an end to the 6th question of the Summa on God's goodness, and we're going to move on to infinity in the next article. God bless you.